Hello and welcome to the first episode of Resilient State, a new podcast made and run by young people taking a fresh look at the UK's national security picture. Traditional security thinking expected threats to be visible, attributable and episodic, and something that could be deterred or defeated by armed capability alone. This podcast takes a different approach to national security, and that's a multi-domain approach. We do this because today power is more often exercised indirectly across systems that sustain everyday life. In this environment, security failures rarely begin with a military confrontation. A multi-domain failure could show up as higher energy bills, empty shelves, cyber outages, banking failures, just to name a few. You don't need to care about geopolitics to feel those effects. They're going to reach you anyway. Our new podcast doesn't seek to make security more complicated, but to make the discussion around security more honest. It reflects how threats actually work today, and why resiliency isn't just a military problem, but a whole of society one. Our aim is not just to explain these risks, but to explain how these risks affect you. I'm your host, Louise, and yes, that is my real name. I am a politics and international relations undergraduate here in London. I've written on Gen Z recruitment rates for the Aerospace magazine, and I've presented on the use of nuclear narratives in non-proliferation efforts for the Royal United Services Institute as part of their project on nuclear issues.
And I'm Luke Marchand. I'm a recovering graduate student of military history from SOAS, University of London. I specialize in insurgency and counterinsurgency, partner force building, the North Korean military, and Canadian national defense, among many other areas of interest. I'll be your co-host for this and several future episodes.
Now, for the first episode of Resilient State, we're going to be joined by two guest experts, each of whom will take us through the major international theatres of Europe and the Sahel. Each of these international theatres is hopefully going to serve two purposes. The first will be to illustrate how events taking place overseas can come back to affect us here in the UK, and how they can affect us here in the UK. The second aim is to explain that what creates a lack of security for a region can be multi-causal, and that a military solution alone is not going to provide you with the answers you need. We're not comparing these regions as places or ranking them against one another. We've deliberately chosen two very different security environments to illustrate how there are multiple causes and influences upon security and insecurity. Things like governance breakdown, economic pressures, and external interference. By choosing two theatres that operate in very different historical and political conditions, we think we're best able to illustrate this point and make the case for our podcast. So, with the introductions done, it's time to jump in and start the episode. Hi, it's Editing Louise here. Just a quick note to any listeners. You might notice the audio changes up at points throughout this episode. That's because it's stitched together from several separate interviews with our guests that took place over the winter holidays. Now, with that warning in place, we can jump back in. Our first guest this week is Dr. Louise Tumchewics. She's a visiting fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a research fellow at the Centre for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. She's advised numerous international organisations and financial institutions, and her work focuses on the intersection of technology, economics and geopolitics. Louise regularly speaks and writes about the global redistribution of power and what it means for Europe and the UK, with a particular interest in how strategic shocks translate into real-world risk and opportunity. Louise, it's wonderful to have you here with us today to talk about the European theatre, and I'd like to start with what might seem like an odd question, but what do we actually mean when we say Europe as a continent? It bleeds into other regions like Asia and the Middle East, and there's often confusion about which countries are considered European and where those boundaries lie. So before we even take a step into the security picture, where on the map are we talking about when we talk about Europe?
Well, I think that's actually an excellent question to start off with, because the word Europe is used as a shorthand. It can mean the European Union member states. It can also mean the European NATO allies, or it can mean all of the countries that make up the European continent, which, if we remember back to, I think it's year 6 geography, we get to color in the map that goes all the way to the Ural Mountains. Well, guess what? That's Europe. So I think, for the purpose of our conversation today, what I'll try to do is distinguish between the European continent when we're talking about that, the European Union when we're talking about that particular political and economic organization, and then the European allies within NATO when we're talking about those states as well.
I think that'll be very helpful because I know it's said as a sort of catch-all term with the speaker understanding what they mean, but then, as you said, it can have different meanings in different associations. So, building from that, I was wondering if you could start explaining the security situation of Europe to us, and again, I'll say Europe, but you can specify as to which Europe you're referring to in your answer. But if you had to sum up Europe's security situation as it stands in late 2025, how would you describe it, and what are the major undercurrents that you'd say are shaping that picture? We, of course, have Russian aggression and the land war in Ukraine to the east, but I also know that there are migration trends and economic trends and political polarisation and these internal undercurrents that are shaping our Europe security picture. So I was wondering if you could just discuss that to start with before we dive into specifics.
Absolutely. So I would say that the word I would pick to sum up Europe's security situation for late 2025, I would say it is challenging. So we have a land war on the European continent, as you have mentioned, and we have an aggressive and belligerent Russia that is intent on using hybrid mechanisms to interfere and destabilize particularly Western European countries, but we also saw their active interference into the Moldovan elections towards the end of 2025. We also have other, quite significant economic and demographic challenges facing Europe as well. So low productivity, low economic growth, and then demographics, an aging population, a declining birth rate, and then the challenges of migration. However, I would not go so far as to say that Europe is facing civilizational erasure. I would say that the US national security strategy released earlier this month is probably exaggerating that a bit. Don't think Europe is in danger of being erased, but it certainly faces many, many challenges, not least its strategic relationship with the US. And that is particularly European NATO allies' strategic relationship with the US, the European Union's relationship with the US, particularly in regards to trade and tariffs, and then continued American support for Ukraine.
So I think there's a general agreement that Europe's security situation is, as you said, challenging. And as you've mentioned, there's this very broad array of reasons as to why that is. But do you think that perhaps there is a hyper-focus on technical fixes? There's currently the talk of the Great Drone Wall across Eastern Europe, which is going to be an integrated multinational defence system. So it'll be a series of incorporated drone defences, which essentially covers the eastern flank of Europe to defend against any Russian incursions and to act as a deterrent power. I think back to a few weeks ago, we saw the events in France where there was a kick-off, to put it bluntly. I believe it was the French Army Chief of Staff, a guy named General Fabien Madon. Forewarning, my pronunciation there might not be perfect, but he was talking to a congress of French mayors, and there was an outcry when General Madon warned of the French spirit, that it lacked the preparedness or the willingness to accept that France and the French people might have to suffer and lose their children in war. And so that suggests to me that there's a deeper reluctance to face and talk frankly about the personal and societal risk that war brings. So do you think that policymakers are perhaps solving the easy problems, these technical problems, and neglecting these harder discussions about risk and loss and suffering, which could actually itself then be driving risk because it might be exacerbating recruitment crises or a lack of general public awareness of the threat level, because we are unwilling to have those harder discussions and we are more willing to talk on easy solutions, and that's these technical solutions?
So what I think is with threats, visible threats to European security, the kind of drone incursions in Poland, in Denmark, and elsewhere this autumn, and the rapid response to, build a great drone wall across Europe, it is reaching for that technological situation. And there's been lots of emphasis on increased military spending and investment in military hardware. But I think what's missing is, well, we can talk about technologies, we can count the number of tanks, we can quantify the billions of euros that are being directed into military spending. It's much harder for European policymakers to clearly articulate between military capabilities and what those strategic objectives they want to achieve with those military capabilities. So the expansion in military hardware has outpaced most European states' capacity to clearly articulate what their strategic objectives are, but also what role would their citizens be taking in achieving those strategic objectives. And furthermore, the European Union as a geopolitical actor remains quite ambiguously defined. What role is it going to take in continental security? Whilst member states are very keen to, demonstrate their investment in military capabilities, the European Union is having difficulty with articulating a clear strategic intention and indeed a role for itself in defense and security. The danger of that is having accelerating rearmament without a cohesive political message and clear strategic objectives can become quite destabilizing.
Do you think we're looking at a genuine new normal for European security, that we are going to be seeing this increased level of sustained threat perception and higher defence spending? Or do you think this is a temporary spike that could fade? If there is a change in the US administration that reaffirms a commitment to Europe, do you think Europe will tone down its new defence spending and reshaping defence? Or do you think it's one where actually now what has happened to trigger this rearmament spending, to trigger this focusing on defence, is permanent, that the change has been made and it now cannot go back? And if you don't mind me following up on that, what indicators would you watch to tell the difference? So if you're somebody who is watching European politics, watching this rapid ramp up of defence spending, what are the indicators that you look for to see if it's going to be a sustained effort or if it's a temporary spiking effort?
This represents a new normal. So regardless of the next administration, I think we have to acknowledge that US hegemonic power has diminished. And even long before Donald Trump, and actually going as far back as the Eisenhower administration, there's been a desire on the part of US presidents for Europeans to shoulder a larger share of the responsibility for European security. Talking about Europeans in this context is, of course, European NATO allies. So I think spending more on defense will be a reality, particularly as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, they may reach a ceasefire agreement. They may reach some form of peace in inverted commas agreement, but there is going to be considerable instability and concern about the shape of that conflict going forwards. I don't think that this will end neatly and nicely with peace breaking out all over and a happy return to the Europe of the 1990s. In terms of indicators to watch to tell the difference between, we're making lots of noise about increased defense investment versus the reality for the long term, it's probably not going to be the kind of stuff that makes headlines or makes for good sound bites. Things like, saying we're going to spend $800 billion on defense is a great soundbite, but it is looking through various budget documents and seeing what money is actually allocated, what money actually gets spent, and where.
Now that we've set out the landscape and why it matters, I think it'll be interesting to examine European security almost in isolation, and then at the end we can circle back and say, what does this mean for the UK? So I think Luke's going to jump in now and talk about Russia, deterrence, and escalation risks. Or at least that's what my scripting says he's going to talk about.
Yeah, I suppose the big one to start with is everyone is talking about it more openly now. Russia as a durable threat to European security, no longer just maybe viewed as a competitor or kind of a nebulous actor that we discuss obliquely in policy documents. It's now being openly stated that Russia is the primary threat to European security. So how does that shape the European security environment in maybe ways beyond the obvious headlines of threats of nuclear war or the prospect of major fighting in the Baltics. How is that shaping the security environment in Europe generally?
Of course, we have Russia's continued war in Ukraine, which very much continues to shape Europe's security environment. And having an active open conflict on the European continent obviously has lots of political and economic effects for Europe. Europe continues to support Ukraine, and the European Union has just committed 105 billion euros to assisting Ukraine without dipping into Russian frozen assets, mind you. So that war continues to shape the European security environment and also the European security consciousness, where states are looking at how Russia is fighting in Ukraine and making decisions about military capabilities based on what they're seeing in the Ukrainian theater. We're also seeing Russian hybrid threats, and whether that's drone attacks, supply chain sabotage, cyber attacks, election interference, as we saw in Moldova. I think this is something that, regardless of the resolution of the war in Ukraine, that this would be something that we would continue to see emanating from Russia. It happened before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I think it would be the kind of aggressive activity that Russia, under its present regime, would be inclined to continue. And of course, we're looking at the map of Europe. European NATO allies, particularly those in the East, will be feeling particularly vulnerable. And that certainly shapes our perception of what activity Russia could take next. The second order effects for UK national security, I think, will be a shift away from concentrating elsewhere in the world or extending global presence to really focus much more on what is happening in Europe and in the UK supporting its European NATO allies, rather than trying to have a presence in the Indo-Pacific, for example, or trying to have a presence in the Middle East, contributing to stabilization missions or things like that. I think a lot more of that attention is going to be focused on Europe and on Eastern Europe. The UK also needs to consider how it strengthens its defenses against Russian hybrid threats, particularly in cyberspace, and particularly things like supply chain security and border security.
So I'm actually going to go a little bit out of order here with the question, because I think this segues a bit better. What are the most plausible escalation pathways below the threshold of open war? You've mentioned, of course, and we've all seen the various Russian campaigns of sabotage, some of which have been pretty daring. I think we all wonder what might have happened if, for instance, the attempted bombing of those cargo airliners had actually come off. So when you look at potential escalation pathways below Russian tanks trying to reach the suburbs of Tallinn, where do you see the likely threats coming from?
Sorry, can I just jump in here ahead of you, Louise? Luke, just a quick one for anybody listening. Could you very briefly run through Russian sabotage and bombing of cargo planes, just so people know what we're talking about?
Right. I don't have the full articles in front of me, but there was a Russian plot which was disrupted, I believe late last year, to plant bombs on a number of cargo planes. These were concealed within the kind of ordinary packages that get shipped by air freight all over Europe. And the jig was up when many of these detonated prematurely in their depots. But had they been rigged or fused correctly, some experts at least believe that they would have detonated in flight aboard these planes with, of course, substantial disruption to the cargo freight that is pretty load-bearing for European and global supply chains. I think we can all see how that might have been a substantial step up, even from Russian drone activity over certain European airports recently that grounded flights, or various other acts of sabotage for hire that the Russians have been undertaking in various countries, generally engaging criminal actors through Telegram. So that's what I'm referencing with this question, of course. When we talk about escalation pathways, I find it hard to believe that even Moscow could really predict how European countries might react to something of that magnitude. So when we think about escalation beyond a sudden conventional military bolt from the blue, what pathways are you looking out for?
So similar to you, I probably wouldn't speculate on how various European states would respond to an escalation or a perceived escalation. But what I would look at is plausible escalation pathways. I think when we're talking about hybrid war, Russia is going to look for, those soft targets. They're going to look for existing vulnerabilities. Driving a tank into Talon is pretty, it's going to provoke quite a predictable response. So maybe it wouldn't do that. But they look at, say, European supply chains are really vulnerable due to open borders and the free movement of goods across Europe. There aren't as many security checks as there should be on cargo. The amount of e-commerce, just the sheer volume of packages that crisscross Europe on a daily basis, makes it quite difficult for cargo to move efficiently and also securely. Another big vulnerability is the cyber domain. European states, with a few notable exceptions, are highly digitized. European populations rely very much on digital banking, digital communication. When is the last time that any of the three of us are going and paying for things in cash? Probably hasn't happened all that recently. Destabilizing or interfering with banking systems, but also looking at other parts of the European continent, not necessarily European NATO countries or European Union countries, but areas like Transnistria or Moldova or even Georgia, and seeing how they can foment dissent, perhaps install or promote a pro-Russian regime.
I guess naturally coming on the heels of that is the question of deterrence. Obviously, the safest way to avoid any of this being tested is to deter these activities before they begin. So where on the part of Europe is deterring Russia working well, and where is it brittle? And that's across all domains, from the military one to political cohesion, industrial capacity, public resilience. Where is Europe scoring well, and where does it have a lot of room to improve?
Across the board, Europe has a lot of room to improve. I think, number one, probably military capability. We've got a big gap between what European militaries need to be capable of doing and what they're currently capable of doing and sustaining, more importantly, as well as political cohesion. What I was saying earlier about having a clear strategic objective and being able to clearly articulate that to a population, and having the social cohesion to know that those kinds of strategic objectives are understood and supported by European populations. I think despite nearly 4 years of a war on the European continent, a lot of day-to-day life for many Europeans probably hasn't changed that much. So are we really deterring Russia, or do we just have some inherent vulnerabilities that we haven't really been willing to address? So I would say across the board, Europe has a lot of room to improve. Number one, military capability. We've got a big gap between what European militaries need to be capable of doing and what they're currently capable of doing and sustaining, more importantly. What I was saying earlier about having a clear strategic objective and being able to clearly articulate that to a population, and having the social cohesion to know that those kinds of strategic objectives are understood and supported by European populations. And really, I think despite nearly 4 years of a war on the European continent, a lot of day-to-day life for many Europeans probably hasn't changed that much. So are we really deterring Russia, or do we just have some inherent vulnerabilities that we haven't really been willing to address?
That's a very good question, a very loaded question, but I've got my own answers. I'm sure most listeners will too. I think lastly, this might be the most expansive question for this section. How do we think that the risk environment changes between the current phase of open conflict in Ukraine and any kind of hypothetical post-war phase, when perhaps that immediate threat of conflict in Ukraine to focus the mind has been taken away? Do we start to see maybe drift in Europe's cohesive approach? And do we start to see maybe a difference of opinion in how quickly or if Europe should re-engage with Russia at all? In other words, what kind of hidden risks would any kind of settlement to the war in Ukraine pose to a long-term European shift to bolster its security? Obviously, that's a very big question, but if you could take a stab at it, I'd appreciate it.
All right. Well, I think, as you say, questions of a potential resolution to the war in Ukraine and the Trump administration's various peace plan options, we could do a whole other podcast episode just on that, maybe several. But coming back to your question, I think we have to distinguish between the current period and then any hypothetical post-war phase. So we have to acknowledge that despite multiple sanctions packages, are we at round 19 now? Russia is not fully cut off from Europe. Europe still imports a number of commodities from Russia, although most of these will be phased out by 2028. However, that's still another 2 years away. And we do see fracturing within Europe over the perception of the Russian threat. So Eastern European states that border Russia typically perceive Russia as an existential threat that necessitates maximum deterrence, where the further west we go, we see that states maintain perhaps a more cautious and even ambivalent approach. Then in Italy and Slovakia, there's been some voicing of growing public fatigue with the current security situation in Europe. And we have Hungary that openly defies European sanctions. So we already see fracturing within Europe regarding that relationship with Russia. Post-war, what constitutes an acceptable relationship with Russia will depend a lot on what shape a ceasefire agreement or peace agreement takes. So, for instance, if the war in Ukraine ends up with a ceasefire and some sort of frozen conflict, reminiscent of the situation in the Donbass from 2014 to 2022, probably sanctions on Russia might not relax, and Russia would still be treated as a pariah by certain European countries, while others might be more open to cooperation and commodities trade. If it was another type of peace agreement, or even one that eventually led, perhaps, to a regime change in Russia, I think we would see the relationship with Russia taking a very different course.
All right. Thank you very much. Get a reprieve. I'll hand it back to Sophie for another line of tuning you.
I mean, it's just one question, actually, and then I'm going to throw it right back to Luke. But I thought I would jump in because we've just had a few questions looking at Russia and the Russian threat. As you said, there's an active land war, so it takes precedent. But I was wondering, are we missing the forest for the trees? I mean, we've seen moves by China to build closer ties with several European nations. They've been very lovey-dovey in some of their communiques and their language towards European nations. And also, might America start pursuing bilateral relations with specific European countries that create further fracturing? Are we missing other threats to European security because we are also focused on the threat of Russia?
Yes, absolutely. Russia is the primary focus and perceived as the primary security threat to Europe. However, because Russia is identified as the primary security threat, doesn't mean that China is Europe's best friend. Remember that China and Russia have their so-called no limits partnership, and that China is supplying drones to both sides of this conflict. Both Russia and Ukraine are highly dependent on Chinese drones and drone component parts in the war. And even if China is attempting to build a relationship and issuing lots of warm, friendly language, that China's understanding of that relationship will be very different to a European understanding of that relationship. Similarly, Europe's relationship with the United States will also be one where this puts Europe in a very awkward position between two of the world's two largest economies that Europe still needs to trade with, but has to be cautious in its relationship with both of them and avoid trading dependencies that it has on the US or creating new dependencies on China. So that is a very difficult position to be squeezed in the middle. It's very hard to be the filling of the sandwich. But I think there are also risks that Europe has to be alive to. Again, we're using Europe as sort of an umbrella term, but there are many versions of Europe, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, and different ambitions for Europe, as we see with the rise of far-right movements which are now openly supported by the US, as mentioned in the national security strategy, that have a very different view of Europe. And the risk of fragmentation, particularly fragmentation created by attempting to respond to the Russian threat.
What does European security actually mean in practice then for day-to-day UK national security? So what do we actually want in terms of security in Europe? Do we want to have, say, secure supply chains moving with minimal restriction? And could we then let the social cohesion within Europe collapse? Or would, for the UK national security picture, would it be willing to allow some of the supply lines and logistics of Europe to collapse, and if it kept social cohesion? So what actually are we talking about when European security? What are the bits that really affect the UK?
The UK cannot see itself as separate from European security. Things that impact Europe will naturally impact the UK. Yes, the UK is an island, the northwest corner of Europe, but there still is so much interaction and dependencies between the UK and Europe that what happens on the continent affects what happens in the UK. Would say it's very difficult to make a choice between, say, supply chains and logistics and social cohesion because the two things are so interconnected, particularly in our modern world where in our lives we have such efficient systems that most of us don't have the kind of redundant supplies. This will probably be quite reminiscent of COVID, that most of us, have moved on from having 6 months supply of toilet paper at home or, a year's worth of tinned tomatoes. So we rely on there being choice and supplies in the shops. And we saw, it was really only 5 years ago, and we saw how quickly social cohesion can break down when consumer goods are not dependably available. Maintaining security and stability of supply is really essential to social cohesion. So if things were to go awry on the continent, that would be of concern to the UK and probably impacting the UK as well.
I was 10 years old when the Brexit debate happened, so my interest in politics kind of grew at a time as we were seeing the acceleration and increasingly loud debate about nationalist strategy. We saw that in the Brexit referendum here in the UK, you see it with the rise of Trump and the America First agenda. How can government, so the UK government or actually the national government of any European nation state or state in whatever iteration of Europe we use, how can a government make a credible case for long-term European defence cooperation whilst there is this domestic current too? Do you think, say, the shared wartime history of Europe, going through World War and World War II, might that help? Could that be utilised more? Or is there another way that you can make the case for this very collective security?
I think we have to go back and look at what are the drivers for the nationalist movement, typically on the right end of the political spectrum. We've seen this throughout Europe. I mean, Britain has probably been the most vocal, but, this was certainly something that has been... We've seen it in France, we've seen it in the Netherlands, we see it in Germany and elsewhere across the continent, that there is this skepticism with membership in the European Union, with greater desire for a renationalization. But what are the drivers of that? Are they economic drivers? Are they social drivers? And thinking particularly in the case of Brexit, is it a lack of understanding about how the European Union works and what its interaction is with the UK, for example, as a nation state? Because I also see many of these movements taking root. I'm thinking in particular AfD in Germany, taking root in the east of the country, which has had lower economic performance, is facing a lot of challenges, and of course not part of West Germany for many decades and only rejoined Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall and has been playing both social and economic catch-up since then. I think we really have to look at the drivers of these nationalist movements and finding effective counter to them. Now, security might not be the most effective counter argument to that, but trying to understand those movements. And I think part of the challenge is many of those things have particular emotional quality to them, and they're typically fear-based. And how do we, as we saw in the Brexit debate, that meeting fear-based emotion with rational facts doesn't always win over your opposing side. So finding an effective way to recapture those populations that are attracted to these nationalist movements.
Thank you. I'll jump in to round off. We've had a very broad discussion today looking at what Europe is and the crisis is facing it. And for every interview on this podcast, we try and end it off with somewhat of a positive note. So for other people like me and Luke, for young people, people who, any of the listeners to this episode today, a lot of the obvious routes into the European theatre have narrowed. So you saw the Brexit decision and the pull away from Europe. So listeners based in the UK trying to get in, say, the European Parliament, that access isn't there anymore. So going in and helping and working within those organisations, working on matters related to security have gone. So I was wondering if you could say what pathways still exist, perhaps through NATO or through other big organisations at play in Europe, which really are working to tackle the issues around security and to ensure the continued stability of Europe. What's there for people to actually say, well, I care about this, and if they wanted to go and have a look at what's taking place and the projects taking place, and if they actually could contribute to them and if they have the expertise for them, what's there? Because I think so many of those traditional routes that we would have taken through our European Union membership aren't there anymore.
We're seeing a shift. We're seeing a fundamental change in both in world order and in security eras. So for people entering the workforce now, or you're leaving university or other forms of study and saying, gosh, I'd like to be involved in defense and security, you'll be moving into a growth area. This will be something that expands, where there will be increased defense spending, more attention paid to defense and security compared to the last 35 or 40 years. I think there will be many different ways for people to pursue careers in defense and security that are not limited to European Union organizations. Of course, there are internships through NATO. And those are quite limited, they're quite competitive, but there will also be a huge expansion, I think, in the commercial sector in hiring, whether that is for a big defense prime or for smaller defense companies. There's also going to be much more emphasis on geopolitical awareness. Defense and security investing that will be in different parts of the commercial sector, whether that's banking or consulting. I think there's going to be abundant opportunities. I would say that it's important to focus on skill development as much as job title or organization. So what role is going to give me an opportunity to develop skills that I can then take with me to another organization? So for instance, if say you applied on a NATO internship and you didn't get it, that doesn't mean that the world of defense and security would be closed to you, but it would be looking at, okay, where can I get experience writing policy or preparing presentations or being exposed to defense procurement and seeing where else, whether that might be the UK government, it might be with commercial entities as well, and trying to collect as many skills as you can. But I would say it is a growth industry. I think it would be far more challenging if you were looking to get into sort of the peace end of things. But I think, yes, it will be something where there will be hiring opportunities for graduates, but it's also an industry that won't be closed to you, even if that isn't your first job. And we'll be thinking, okay, what kind of skills do I need that are attractive in this particular industry, in the defense industry or in the defense and security space?
I think my last question for the episode would be just For any listeners who are really interested in European security, what would you say are the publications that you look to which actually you think are really good at reporting on what's happening in Europe and within Europe, and not just the big headline states of Germany and France, but across all of Europe and actually a broad range of areas? Because I think I often have a look at, say, the BBC, but for something to make the international news headlines, usually it loses some of the detail that perhaps people might want, which actually really helps explain the picture on the ground. So where do you go to find out what's actually happening within Europe and on the ground?
Oh, wow. That is a big question. And perhaps I'll send some suggestions that you can attach in the show notes.
Absolutely. We'll link anything you send into the episode description. So everything you send, we'll be able to link in.
So it depends, of course, what a reader is after. I think for longer form, typically more in-depth articles tend to have a transatlantic focus, but foreign affairs is always a good bet for understanding some larger picture background. Then things like Geopolitical Monitor, if you are very focused on the war in Ukraine specifically, the Institute for the Study of War. On the more academic end, you have things like The Conversation or War on the Rocks. We're so fortunate right now that we actually have just an abundance of outlets, and it's possible to get too much information rather than too little. But with any source, I would really encourage listeners and prospective readers to try to learn as much as they can about that source, its editorial bias, who the contributors are, what its objectives are, and really importantly, what its fact-checking process is. We have an abundance of information out there, but we are also living in an era of disinformation and misinformation. So looking at our sources with a critical eye is really important.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end. We've gone through all the questions we have in the time allowed, and I think you've definitely helped broaden our understanding of Europe, not just the threats that the continent is facing, but what's happening within it and what the future holds. I think what this conversation has really showed is that European security can't rely alone on heavy investing in military capabilities, which is a bit of a problem, seeing as Europe is currently investing very heavily in military capabilities and in military capabilities alone, it sometimes feels. But I think talking to you has really made this point that if goods don't reach shelves, if energy prices spike, or if trust in institutions start to erode, then security on the European continent is already failing. As you've made clear, the UK can't see itself as separate from Europe in this. We're too interconnected. So what happens on the continent won't stay on the continent. And that's exactly why, we're taking this multi-domain approach in this podcast, because today's security is about how your society functions under pressure, not just what happens on the battlefield. But Louise, thank you very much for joining us. I mean, it's been incredibly valuable to have you help set out the landscape for Europe for this episode and really explain European security for us.
Now, our second guest today is Elijah Glantz. He is a research fellow in the Organized Crime and Policing team at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI for short. His work focuses on criminal network structures, illicit finance, and law enforcement responses around the world, with projects spanning sub-Saharan Africa, state involvement in organized crime and narcotics, and trends in UK organized crime. He's here with us today to talk about the Sahel and how developments there feed directly into the UK's wider security picture. Elijah, much like our previous guest, Louise, I wanted to start by grounding us on the map. I know that the word Sahel comes from the Arabic for shore or coast. It's often described as the shoreline of the Sahara, where the desert starts to give way to more fertile land. But from your perspective, how should we understand the Sahel, and where do you see its boundaries?
Sure. So the Sahel doesn't reference specific states insofar as it does a region, specifically the Sahelian region, of course, which is the largely desert region in the north of West and Central African countries, but also in the south of the North African countries. It spans well over a dozen countries, many of which we'll be familiar with, from the north of Cameroon, the north of Nigeria, to large swaths of Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and the south of countries like Morocco and all of the northern countries, in particular Algeria being the largest country in Africa and having the largest share of the Sahel. But yeah, it's a very large area that cross-cuts so many different, not only countries, but ethnic groups and tribal groups, both religions and ways of life. But the UK has a particular tie to a few of them. Of course, Nigeria will ring a bell. Nigeria being one of the countries with the closest ongoing ties and a remarkable history that goes back, many, many, many years, of which there are migration patterns that go formally as well as informally. Then there's a variety of countries that service a number of European needs. I mean, everything from Niger's uranium deposits and their strategic importance to countries like the UK or countries like France, but also the wider interest in stability. From an organized crime perspective, West Africa and a lot of these states, though not the Sahel, have seen surges in drug trafficking, some of which goes overland. Of course, probably of most note that people are, if familiar at all with the Sahel, is the Sahel's struggle with terrorism, with armed insurgency, groups such as the Islamic State in the West African provinces, groups such as Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab to the east. They've dominated the headlines, especially as the Islamic State has lost a lot of its power in the Middle East. It has certainly shifted and found incredible amounts of support in parts of West Africa. Those have served as springboards going south towards the coastal areas of West and Central Africa, as well as surging north with well-known attacks going on in northern cities and coastal cities in the north of Africa. So in reality, it represents a massively diverse area of people, countries, cultures, but also in terms of challenges, not only facing it, but also facing the UK and European partners upstream.
So if we tried to present a case for the Sahel and what's happening on the ground right now, what would you summarize the security picture as in one or a couple of words? Is it insurgency? Is it state fragility? Is it regional rivalry? Or is there something else going on there really driving this instability?
I would say regional rivalry, not so much. While there may be regional rivalries, those aren't the preeminent issues. Insecurity is rife in the region, and the countries in West and Central Africa struggle with it the most. Where do they struggle with it the most? They struggle with it in the Sahel. That's because the government is only partially present. That isn't to say that if the government were to be present, all these problems would be gone. But there is a huge mix of very complex security actors, many of whom are in active conflict. It's the government, local groups, local tribes, separatist groups to insurgent/terrorist groups that are ideologically driven, as well as organized crime groups that dominate a lot of the region. So what we have is this very fragile and very insecure constellation of actors who are security providers. But those same security providers in that region tend to also be the instigators of a lot of the conflict. We don't have a state in the sense that we would think about it. It is very much a contested territory, with the cities being contested for not only the resources, but also the ability to transit through those areas, through the paths overland. So yeah, a very fragile part of it's arguably the world's most disadvantaged, insecure, and conflict-affected part of the world. We look at Sudan, the north of Niger, Burkina Faso. But overall, it's a place marked by rampant insecurity without a whole lot of hope in terms of what comes next.
So for this instability, what do you see as the biggest drivers, and which of those pressures are going to get worse? Which ones do you think are going to get better? Violence, extremism, governance breakdown, climate stress, economic shocks? What's really driving the instability? Or is it that each group has its own drivers and actually there's no common theme that could really be found across the actors present in the Sahel?
Yeah, well, it will always be a mix. Rusi, his colleagues and I did a large piece of work spanning multiple years where we looked at the links between organized crime and terrorism from the ground up. We looked at Mozambique, we looked at Kenya, we looked at Nigeria. And what we found is that for each, almost at an individual level, the reasons will be different, or at least they will be multiple. If we're looking for a single cause, it's very unlikely we'll find one. What we do find is this plethora, the myriad reasons why people are facing instability. And that goes from incredibly lackluster infrastructure and state services when it comes to everything that we expect the state to give us every day. That is almost never provided there, even down to basic security if the state is present at all. So economic opportunities are absolutely lacking. And then when we think about how a lot of people live in the Sahel, it's usually subsistence-based agriculture, and that is under incredible duress due to climate change, which is triggering not only internal migration, but is also bringing organized crime groups as well as armed actors into the fold, as there is now a greater incentive to involve themselves in securing access to resources being everything from gold, but also basic infrastructure, basic livestock, basic agriculture, because these continue to grow in their salience because they are rarer and rarer and therefore more valuable. Again, there's an ideological component to this. I think typically when we read the news here and we hear that Boko Haram or the Islamic State in the West African province have done X or Y, we tend to associate it as all of this monolith of very ideologically driven actors. From our research and from that of others, that's typically not the case. You will absolutely have an ideological component to this. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But the reason for which people will join a group will oftentimes be less ideological and more about, I need a job, and joining an armed group is a form of employment, or I need access to funds, I need access to food, I need access to some sort of regular income. These groups are the ones that are often most able to provide it. So all of this insecurity plagued with ideological conflicts, inter-ethnic, inter-tribal conflicts, as well as the absence of the state, oftentimes with the state making things, perhaps accelerating vulnerability, makes for a very multi-causal and very confused picture as to why we've gotten to where we are.
So to get across to our listeners a picture of what's happening on the ground in Sahel, is it possible to name the big three of who the big actors are in the region? And can you say what they're trying to achieve? Or is it that there's too many actors to be able to actually pick out the biggest three?
Yeah, I think as much as I'd like to give kind of like, here are the three, I will give three, but it's often a lot more complex. And this is what our research finds. I mean, Boko Haram and the Islamic State are obviously the top two. And then if we count parts of Sudan, then obviously the RSF are one, but the RSF are rather limited to there.
Just a quick one for anyone listening. Could you just explain what the RSF is?
Sorry, yes. The Rapid Support Forces, which are currently at war with the Armed Forces of Sudan, which, I mean, every 2 weeks we see headlines of atrocities being committed in Sudan during their civil war. Essentially, those are the two forces that are fighting it out. They're a non-state group. They function as a state. So if we're going to consider them an armed group, absolutely, they would figure into the top three, even though they're largely restricted to just Sudan, of course, fighting in the Sudanese civil war. What I would say is, while the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, are much more of a coherent, still to some degree decentralized organization, if we look at Boko Haram and the Islamic State, those are very different organizations based on one state to another. One region within a country will have very different manifestations of what it looks like. You may have, in some areas, very ideologically aligned groups and active, let's say, contingents of Boko Haram who will do the kidnappings in Nigeria, for example, the mass murders and the like. Then you have others that perhaps resemble a little bit more like an organized crime group. Some of them will look more like a territorial defense force. So again, what we consider part of an organized crime, or what we consider part of an insurgent or a terrorist group, is largely because we abstract it at a very high level. We say, if we were to categorize them as something, we have to say that they're the Islamic State in West Africa. Although a lot of these groups are smaller regional groups that will still fight between themselves. At a very top level, we're looking at the Islamic State, we're looking at Boko Haram. But the reality is that there's a massive fracturing and decentralized and very, very varied manifestation of what these groups look like. Some will be very ideological, some will be organized purely along territorial defense, and some will be about taxing all forms of goods, licit and otherwise. So yeah, as much as it's an unhelpful answer, it reflects the reality in the region, which is that you can't put your finger on one thing and say this is everything, because there's just so much variety in the Sahel.
So I think we've looked a lot now at non-state actors, the rise, the falls, the fractures, the different actors on the ground. I think it'd be really interesting though to see how has the regional political order shifted over the last couple of years, especially with the growing split between ECOWAS and the Alliance of the Sahel States. And to explain both those terms, I'm going to leave that to you. But shifting it back to this state lens, governance lens, how has that picture changed in response to some of this instability that we're seeing?
ECOWAS is the economic and increasingly are attempting to be political union of West African states, and the Alliance of Sahel States, or the acronym AES, because it goes by its French lettering, is the fractured splinter group, the boy band of the putschists or the coup d'etats, the leaders, all military in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, who obviously overthrew their elected governments, elected under some heavy caveats in some of those senses. But all the same, they were military leadership. They will now likely be joined by some newcomers who have overthrown their governments in recent weeks. There's certainly a lot of fear in ECOWAS of it spreading. The Nigerians are particularly fearful of it continuing to have a domino effect, whereby what we saw in Benin, we saw it in Guinea, where apparently, allegedly in Benin, we had French contingents of the French armed forces intervening. So there's definitely an atmosphere of coup d'etats rising and this splintering between ECOWAS, which is the kind of established political way of operating in West Africa, both domestically and regionally, and these military groups. But it's worth noting that the largest, if not, I would say the most significant driver, at least the rhetoric driving domestically. Abroad, we get a lot about how it's anti-Western, anti-colonialist, pro-Russian, which to a large extent it is. But domestically, it has much more to do with the security situation. It has much more to do with the insecurity that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are facing in their Sahelian territories. In Burkina Faso, the government had resorted to giving arms and legal militia status to what they called bush warriors, the Kogbuogo fighters, because the state recognized that it could not fight to save and protect these communities. So they said, hey, you're your own army now. A lot of these groups have since gone on to do some rather unsavory things, many of which have tried to defend their communities. Bottom line is that there continues to be massive fighting with insurgent groups, with banditry, which was a large reason why a lot of these coups d'etats found a significant amount of support within not only the armed forces, but also the public. That's because they were tired of having the government unable to contain the threat. Of course, the challenge is now, have they been able to contain the threat? The answer is no. Mali, Bamako is currently surrounded by insurgents. They've had a fuel embargo for weeks now. There hasn't been able to get any fuel into the country. Embassies have been evacuated and so on. Burkina Faso is no further along, despite all of the very public displays of Captain Traore's grand leadership, a lot of which being Russian disinformation peddled to other ECOWAS states. So again, there's a whole bunch of challenges, and the instability in the Sahel is actually inextricably linked to the rise of the AES and a lot of the tension we see between ECOWAS and the AES today.
From an organised crime perspective, what do you see the major illicit economies in the Sahel right now that's really financing this instability? Because I think it's a really key point that you can't get your hands on weapons, on trading, on food, on the resources needed to operate as a non-state actor group or as a militia or as an insurgency group if you don't have financing. Is it trafficking routes, smuggling ecosystems, illicit finance?
In terms of large illicit economies in the region, we'll have everything from cigarettes. The illegal cigarette economy anywhere in the world is absolutely massive, usually run by mafia-style groups. In the Sahel, it's a lot of these insurgent groups and traders who benefit from it. We're looking at gold. There's quite a bit of gold, and now with the ever-increasing price of gold, it's increasingly valuable and therefore increasingly contested. We're looking at so everything from counterfeit pharmaceutical goods, because everything from tramadol to ibuprofen is almost impossible to get from the legal supply chain. So it has to be smuggled, or counterfeited. People smuggling, unfortunately, is an absolutely massive business, usually from the sub-Saharan states, being West and Central Africa, through the Sahel into North Africa, and then usually into North Africa, perhaps onwards into Europe. That is a large business model. The role that organized crime and then insurgency play is quite distinct. There was a lot to do about a decade, 2 decades ago about organized crime and terrorism being one and the same. That has largely since been dispelled, and I'm quite proud of some of me and my colleagues and I have been quite prominent in dispelling those myths. What we have is terrorist groups and insurgent groups will typically control an area, and insofar as you control an area, you control the economy, which is overwhelmingly informal. In the Sahel, the majority of all economic activity is done off the books informally, whether it's drugs being an illegal crime or whether it be, trading textiles. It just so happens that it's informal. When you own control over a territory, you control those economies. You have the ability to regulate them. You have the ability to tax them. The largest form of revenue raising that we're seeing isn't so much the sale of goods from the groups themselves. Obviously, it does happen, but we're mainly looking at their taxing like a state would, perhaps a little less efficiently and a little bit more haphazardly, but they are taxing all of the trade and the economic activity in the territory they control. If a smuggler, for example, wants to pass through a certain part of the Sahel, you're paying the group to ensure safe passage. It's protection money. We have these massive militia economies where the more territory a militia controls, the more they can tax. And the more they can tax, the more arms they can raise, the bigger their territory can get. And it repeats. And that's true for Libya, that's true for Burkina Faso, that's true for pretty much everywhere in Sudan. Your ability to project force and control territory directly links to your ability to tax the activity within it, illegal or otherwise. There have been cases of groups committing crimes and directly profiting from them. In 2012, Janjaweed militias went into the north of Cameroon and slaughtered hundreds and hundreds of elephants, took the ivory and sold it. That was used as an example of the overlap. That has so far been the exception rather than the rule. It's important to note that a lot of organized crime groups don't want to be labeled terrorists because you get a lot more attention. If you're an organized crime group, the police look after you. If you're a terrorist, it's a drone with a missile looking at you. So there's a fundamental incentive to not be labeled a terrorist because you don't want the drone, you want the cops.
So building on that mention of human trafficking, going up to North Africa, going on to Europe, where do we see perhaps a tie between the UK and the Sahel, and what happens in the Sahel does it affect the UK? Or is the UK bubbled and removed from activities on the ground in the Sahel?
Some of it. I mean, for trafficking routes, they're not as common to go up to the UK. A lot of them are French speaking, so they go to France or they stay in Europe. There's a bit of an unpopular opinion that the current trend is that there's illicit finance. We can follow the money everywhere. It's incredibly difficult to follow the money because often the way payment is done, not in the majority of the times, but oftentimes is not even with money. It's usually a form of trading, of exchange. And when it is money, which again is still the majority of cases, it's cash. Banking penetration rates, meaning the extent to which people in these countries have access to online banking or a bank account at all. The further we go into the Sahel, the closer we reach zero. So does somebody have a Standard Chartered or a Barclays or a Nationwide current account? Do they have cash and savings ISAs? No. Is the UK able to interdict a majority of the flows going into the Sahel through its financial system as much as we wish it could? The answer is no. There's been an increasing amount of attention paid to sanctioning economic actors and constraining their ability to finance themselves. Again, a lot of that, in my opinion, has to do with the government either not looking or ignoring the fact that these actors do not operate with the formal financial system. And if they do, it's usually through Hawala, which is a system of informal money transfers. If you're moving a massive amount of money, it's not going to go in your name through a bank. It is going to go through informal money transfers to get them in and out of Europe. Law enforcement and financial authorities have been rather unsuccessful at cracking down on in the past, ever since it was a big thing in the early 2000s. So it's difficult. It's a lot of these smaller groups, because they're not part of this one monolithic Boko Haram megastructure with a nice headquarters that needs to finance itself. It's much more, we're going to tax our local economy and make the money that way. Weapons, they get taken from local stockpiles, they get bought in from Libya, they get cash-based. So it's very difficult to think of a way in which we can meaningfully interdict a lot of the funds, with the exception of very corrupt or very bad human rights abusing leaders, many of whom will actually have very nice apartments in London, or they'll have nice cars in Paris. But in terms of the day-to-day financing, the vast majority will never touch a bank, let alone a UK bank. If we're looking at migration, I'm not going to say migration is a threat, because migration is not a threat. Much of it is legal migration or regular migration, whereby people are legally claiming asylum. So it's not all organized immigration crime, which I think often it gets characterized as. The French and the continental Europeans, the EU, probably have a much larger exposure here in terms of dealing with the significant influx of migrants across the Mediterranean, that being Spain, Italy, Greece, and France, of course. The UK, being further afield, has its own problems, but less so. The top three that arrive into France are going to be different than the top three who arrive into the UK. Top three groups in that by nationalities are typically, it fluctuates between Afghanistan, Syria, and Vietnam. Whereas if we look at France, it's much more, we're looking at West African states, we're looking at Central African states. If there's a desire from the UK government to go abroad and secure and prevent the proliferation of terrorism and insurgency, then obviously that's the hotbed for it currently. And never mind the Middle East, the amount of ODA money, the amount of overseas development assistance that is given to countries and partners like Nigeria, who are huge economic partners and can be huge economic partners. I think 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 people born are born on the continent. We're talking about massive growing economies and potentially fantastic partners for the UK and Europe, which are facing an existential threat, perhaps not Nigeria, but the others, of instability wrecking the government or instability triggering events like coups, which can be just as destabilizing. In the pursuit of stable economies and development, the UK absolutely has an interest in making sure that it's contained and that the system that is underpinning all the instability is brought to a halt.
So if you're looking at the UK from a national security picture and you're looking at the Sahel, are we more concerned about the new home for terrorism that the Sahel provides, places to finance, recruit, train, reach and grow? Or should we be more concerned about the effects it has on friends in the region, allies in the region, the risk instability poses to governance, to economic growth? Which is more of a concern for people looking at the UK national security picture?
I think the loss of the existential threat to democracy and good governance is so present in the region, in West and Central Africa in particular. What we see is, there's an existential threat of you lose complete access and partnership with countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali when they have a coup. That's because they position themselves towards the Russians. The Russians are incredibly invested in ensuring they have a positive image in West Africa. They are in no small part ensuring that a lot of the coups d'etats survive and thrive. And they represent that as kind of a, hey, look, we are your natural partner. So from a security perspective, if I'm the UK, it's not necessarily the best use of time to look at it and say, how is this affecting me directly? There's actually second order impacts, which is we are looking at a fundamental attempt to reshape the relationship between West and Central Africa and the West, the UK being one of the large partners there. That's not only Russia, but also China. The amount of infrastructure investment that's gone in there, the potential for state capture, the potential for influencing everything from business deals to military bases is considerable. And to the credit of the government today, they recognize largely that this is an issue, but there hasn't been a strategy formulated for what to do about it because the issues manifest themselves at so many levels. At the local level where nobody has anything to eat, to the level of ideological extremism, all the way to the fact that many of these leaders are very corrupt. There's a fundamental issue, but it ties to wider geopolitical shifts and the wider picture of, security in a volatile world is absolutely there for the UK.
If the Sahel teaches us anything, it's that security can't be solved with military tools alone. It can't be solved by just giving out arms to groups and telling them to secure their own security and that they're their own army. If you're the UK and you don't want to allow Russia and China to continue to have that influence on the ground, and you want it to be present and help secure security and also have that UK is here and is helping, what would you look for the UK to do and what would you perhaps advise it looks at?
Well, first of all, the military stuff, it's the French went into Mali with Operation Barkhane and they went border to border. They blitzed the country. They removed the large and well-mobilized organized armed groups, but then they had to withdraw eventually. And now we're back to square one. The same playbook that we saw unfold in Afghanistan, Iraq, so on, is exactly what happened in Mali. It's exactly what the Russians are facing in Burkina Faso with the Wagner group. Well, now the Africa Corps and some of the private military or paramilitary groups, they'll go in and commit various human rights abuses, but then they find that once they withdraw, everything comes back because these political economies of instability and informality are the causes here, rather than just having men with guns present, which oftentimes makes the system more dangerous, particularly to women and girls. In terms of what we can do, it's complex. It's a mix of development aid, but it's also engaging as partners in economic development. The work we're doing shouldn't just be, we're developing things, we're giving money. There's a lot of investment to be had. There's a fundamental need to engage perhaps a bit more pragmatically, diplomatically in how we engage. A fundamental tension between a lot of the leaders in West and Central Africa being quite difficult to work with. They have their own difficult pasts and difficult CVs, if we'll call it that. But there's also a need to engage with them because otherwise they'll drift more towards opponents. We're stuck in this middle where we don't have a strategy of how are we going to engage with good governance. Are we going to push for good governance, or are we going to essentially promote whoever's in power just in order to make sure that they remain friends with us? That strategy has not become clear either explicitly or implicitly. As a result, it creates a lot of uncertainty because as leaders change and as narratives get built, the West are kind of caught in this very reactive, there's nothing pragmatic about the relationship. There's no rebuilding. There's no, Macron, in France will only go to Africa maybe once or twice. You'll never see Keir Starmer going. You'll never see anybody else going. So if we ever want to have a policy of actual action towards helping the Sahelian states and the countries that have the Sahel within them develop or face their security issues, it's not going to be done by throwing 100 million in ODA money or saying, here's some weapons, here's some military support aid, when the politicians and the premiers will never set foot in the country and never exert that kind of political influence. As much as the UK will never, and a variety of these countries will never actually lean in as a partner, they will not be able to create some of the effects, the positive effects and deterrence against Russia and China that they hope to have.
So I would say these are very traditionalist approaches. It's not that new, increasing aid, being present, showing signs of perhaps not cooperation, but a willingness to talk and engage with others. So what are some non-obvious domains that the UK could really look at? I'm thinking in terms of, could it help build financial systems and build on our expertise in financial systems? Or perhaps could it work in the information environment? Before the government collapse in Burkina Faso, there was a lot of Russian disinformation which helped exacerbate and accelerate the instability there. Are there these non-obvious routes the UK could take that would give it an approach different from the traditional give development aid, go on a state visit, host each other's MPs?
It's difficult because Chinese influence is largely through the lens of economic development. But that's because they offer interest rates that no bank in the UK or in the EU or in the US would ever offer. They offer an acceptance of risk, of defaults that we would never accept. So there's fundamental imbalances in the playing field. But something that I turn to that has little to do with security or defense, at least at first thought, is the soft power, the social capital that the UK in particular has in countries like Nigeria. If you ever go, so, last time I was there, if you have the pleasure of visiting some of the capital cities around there, you'll notice that almost every other billboard you see will be for a visa service. Will be visit the UK, visit the US, visit France. And if you go around and you walk around, everybody's wearing a football shirt. And they're not wearing CSK Moscow. They're not wearing any Chinese football shirts. They're wearing Man City. They're wearing PSG. And I know it sounds silly in the sense of like, oh, well, we're facing with Boko Haram and you want to give people more football shirts. But I think that there is a fundamental lack of understanding about what the dynamic comparative advantage is. So not that it deals directly with security, but if we're talking about overall perceptions and fighting against the dominant narrative of rejecting the West and embracing China and Russia and others, there's arguably no more powerful tool to curry good favors between people and states than soft cultural power. Everything from sports to music to theater to movies to so on, cultural exchanges, which currently don't happen. They're left to the embassies. When was the last time you saw an MP go to Africa? When was the last time you saw a tour go to Africa? It's not going to restore land and kick out Boko Haram, but there is a big thing to be said there when it comes to the great power competition in the region. As for insecurity and development, to me, it all comes down to development. It all has to do with the economic pressures that people are under. If we're going to continue to cut aid budgets, in the US's case, pretty much cut them all. In the UK's case, cut 40% is what they've done. And then we're going to wonder why all of a sudden Sudan is under that much more threat, or we're looking at parts of northern Nigeria, which perhaps were reliant on US or UK aid for their basic provision of goods or economies. And we're going to wonder why suddenly there's an increase in recruitment or there's an increase in violence or instability. Well, you don't really have to look for why there's been a change. You need to point it yourself, which of course we will never do, or at least the governments won't do. But if we're going to backtrack on development aid, when pretty much every piece of research says a lot of this instability is driven from lack of development, we shouldn't be surprised when things get worse and then all the second order effects kind of kick in.
My question to wrap up would be looking ahead to keep track of instability in the Sahel when it is such a complex picture, when there are so many groups, it's such a broad area, and there's so many drivers. What are the main signals or trends that you look for to cut through all the noise and see what's happening on the ground? I think if our listeners want to keep track of what's happening on the ground, because of your expertise, you can look at lots of different pieces of information and build up a very holistic picture. But if people who might be interested but don't have the time, what are the few signals that they should really look at which can help translate the broader picture to them?
That's a great question. If you want an email every other couple of days that gives you a summary of what's going on, Africa Confidential is fantastic. I couldn't recommend it enough. It's free for, you get it in your inbox and it will give you that disaggregated picture from the politics to the economic development. There's also a variety of other outlets. I would stress going local, because the more local content production, the less likely you get this very high level of useless abstraction of Boko Haram. And then it's, okay, we don't know where, we don't know why, we don't know who, which typically happens in the massive kind of global media. So Young Africa is a fantastic French language source. I believe they have some content in English. If you're interested in Nigeria, for example, they have a Guardian, the NG Guardian is fantastic. Every country will have some really, really reputable, fantastic journalists who produce high quality stuff. Don't be afraid to jump into it. I know there's typically a reservation about the quality of this news. Nonsense. They know best. So definitely dive into local media because they will give you a level of detail that gets lost very quickly when 10 news pieces need to be aggregated into a single one that's worthy of the international newswire. By that point, we've lost a lot of the nuance that makes the Sahel so complicated.
I think what we can do in the episode description is we will link Africa Confidential and some of those news sources for anybody interested. And then building from that, you've laid out the region with a very tricky and complex security situation, with the insecurity and instability probably going to accelerate and spread further. For people who wanted to get involved with securing the region or the groups on the ground that are helping to keep stability, what are the main actors or organisations doing on the ground work to help with that? I'm thinking, are there any on the ground that are helping, or ways that people could, if they listen to this and got the mad idea, I shall go and help stability in the region, where would they go? Because we've done a lot on what's making the region unstable. So I thought if we end on a slightly happy note of what's helping the region, that might be a good way to end off the episode.
I don't know if it's going to be a happy ending. The truth is that a lot of times in these conflict zones, the government will prohibit civil society organizations from operating. And a lot of the civil societies that do are community level, and therefore they have the same restrictions that the criminal groups, and they're not banking. So there's no, hey, let me revolute you 10 pounds so I can support your work. That doesn't really exist, particularly when it comes to West and Central Africa. Red Cross, especially in Sudan, currently changes week by week. It's certainly the world's most glaring and devastating humanitarian tragedy at the moment. Absolutely in the Sahel, there's a variety of aid organizations, Doctors Without Borders, everything to Reporters Without Borders. But there's a massive need for better journalism in the region and for the sustenance of journalism in the region. So I can't in good conscience tell you to go to the north of Nigeria or to Burkina Faso or Mali. If you show up and say, hey, I'm here for security, they're going to think you're a PMC and you're going to get arrested. Be informed. If you find yourself in a position where you're working on this region, it's really important just to emphasize how complex and how many different factors push in different ways. One day, one person with a gun, we call him Boko Haram. The next day, we call them an organized criminal. It's just because they need employment. It's about looking back and not allowing ourselves to get carried away by what appears to be monolithic ideologies or anything like that. If we lose the detail, when the detail is what's driving the problem, then we only end up with giving ourselves bigger sticks to hit bad people over the heads with, which never actually solves any of the problems, or at least very few of them. So yeah, if you're looking for a trip, there's definitely coastal cities in the north of Africa and in South, Central, and West Africa, definitely worth visiting. Support their economies, support the overall development of the country. Definitely recommend. There's some fantastic places. But yeah, until then, just focus on staying informed, because the people with guns are not typically the people you want to have guns. Let's not confuse state presence with good presence.
Thank you, Elijah. It's been really great to talk with you today to understand the depth of that instability in the Sahel and exactly what's fueling it. I think, again, much like with Louise in Europe, you've helped lay out a case that the insecurity we see in the Sahel, whilst it's different to what Louise talked about with European security, it still brings this point across that what creates that instability to begin with is incredibly multi-causal, and there is no one simple cure-all to it. It's also been really interesting to listen to how what actually happens in the Sahel, even though it's thousands of miles from the UK, it can still impact us here in the UK through those second-order effects. So I just want to say it's been great to talk with you today, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid that's all you're going to hear from me for now, although stay tuned, because Luke and I, we were talking as we did this, and we're aware that we've done 2 theatres, but we thought it would be really good to get a 3rd major international theatre in. So stay tuned to see if that will come about. We'll probably add it into this episode if it does, but for now, that's all from me. So I'll leave Luke to sign off for the episode, and do listen to him because he's got some bits to say about what our next episode here at Resilient State is going to be on. And I hope to see you all again next time.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. There's obviously so much more ground we could cover in each of them, and hopefully we'll be able to return to both the regions and some of the themes we touched on in future episodes. And of course, thank you for listening to Resilient State, a national security podcast made by young people, but for everyone. You can find us in all the usual suspects, Instagram, TikTok, and Substack. Our handles will be linked below in the episode description. We've got another episode coming out in 2 weeks' time on Monday, 19th January. Make a note, where we'll be talking with Professor Keith Hartley about the role of markets in defense. You can also find our wider release schedule for the next 6 months over on Instagram. Until then, that's all from us here at Resilient State. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll tune in for the next episode.